Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. One thing that stood out to some in the 2025 federal budget was a notable absence of specifics on the now under review zero emissions vehicle mandate. Ottawa is conducting a 60-day review of the policy that requires every light vehicle rolling off a dealership lot to be zero emissions within 10 years. Brian Livingston is one such person. He is a senior fellow with the C.D. Howe Institute and an executive fellow with the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. He believes the ZEV mandate will keep Canadians from getting behind the wheel. And while he may not be opposed to the idea of transitioning to electric vehicles, he's got some suggestions on how to move forward and when.
You're going to have a hard political sell if you try to force people to buy things that right now they're not prepared to buy. And you're going to have an even harder political sell if you force companies to shut in sales and Canadians can't buy the 400,000 vehicles that I mentioned that they need to, frankly, to live their lives. And some of them live in rural areas and some of them just aren't quite prepared to go to the full battery electric vehicle. And plug-in hybrids, I think, are a great thing.
He joins us now. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here, Michael.
You argue that Ottawa had to waive the 20% ZEV sales requirement for 2026 because the market will see thousands of vehicles in shortfall. How do you get to your numbers?
The number that I'd like people to take away is 400,000, and that's the number of sales of cars, gasoline vehicles that would have been shut in 2026 if the ZEV mandate had gone ahead for 2026. Let me do a little background on just what exactly is a ZEV, or zero emission vehicle, for your audience. Zero emission vehicles are either full battery vehicles called BEVs, battery electric vehicles. They're the Teslas, Hyundais, and Kias of the world. They have only an electric motor and only batteries. They have no gasoline engine or no gas tank. Then you have something called plug-in hybrids. They have both both an electric motor and electric batteries, smaller than the BEVs, the battery electric vehicles, but still giving them a range of about 50 to 80 kilometers. But they also have a backup gasoline engine and a gas tank in case, as and when the battery gets discharged and is no longer able to move the vehicle. Lastly, there is something called pure hybrids, sometimes just referred to as hybrids. That's the Prius that people, I think, are quite familiar with. And they have a battery and they have an electric motor. They also have the gasoline engine and the gas tank. The difference from a plug-in hybrid is you can't plug the batteries in a pure hybrid to charge them. Obvious question is, well, then how do they charge the batteries? The answer is the engineers have devised a mechanism called regenerative braking that allows the braking of the car to actually generate electricity, which will recharge the battery. What hybrids get is they get better gas mileage, about 30 to 40% better gas mileage than the typical gasoline vehicle. So that's kind of the background as to the different types of vehicles that are out there. The ZEV mandate, as the name implies, is a requirement to, as you said, have targets. 20% of cars, light vehicles sold in 2026 have to be ZEVs, going to up to 60% in 2030, and then, as you mentioned, a full 100% in 2035. I like to phrase it as it's also, if you look at the flip side, it's a prohibition on the selling of gasoline light vehicles. You're only allowed to sell 80% gasoline vehicles in 2026, only 40% in 2030, and 0% in the year 2035. It's important to note that that's the basis of the regulations. They're under something called the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, or CEPA. It's under the criminal power that the federal government has under the Constitution. So there's a prohibition against selling cars and selling light vehicles that contravene these ZEV mandate rules. So first thing I did to answer your question is I looked at the sales data in 2024. That's now historical data. I had access to it. In Canada, we sold about 1.85 million light vehicles in Canada in the year 2024. That's everything from cars, pickup trucks, crossover vehicles, which are basically cars with 3 seats and no trunk. And of that 1.85 million, about 270,000 were ZEVs, either battery electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids. That's about 14.5%, which is obviously less than 20%. Why are people hesitant in some cases to buy battery electric vehicles or even plug-in hybrids? Well, first is affordability. They're more expensive. Second, there's range anxiety. They only go 400 kilometers versus a car with a gas tank will go 600 kilometers. There's cold weather. I won't get into the chemistry, but in cold weather, I think everybody knows your battery doesn't have as much capacity to generate electricity and therefore to drive a vehicle and therefore have range. You have a lesser range in the winter. And lastly, the charging infrastructure. If you are in a remote location in a rural area, there may not be many charging stations for you to go to. And there'd be nothing worse than being stuck in a cold January night, 100 kilometers out in the bush, and no charging facility nearby.
I understand the range anxiety thing has largely been resolved through the science that you're talking about, and the fact that the reality is most of us don't need a 400-kilometer vehicle in any given day on a day-to-day basis. But the infrastructure aspect is super important as well. But it strikes me that you don't trust the invisible hand of the market. If we require people to buy electric vehicles, we'll be making more of them. Prices come down as the supply goes up, kind of thing. You don't think that we're going to see an increased supply when we see an increased demand?
Right now, 2 years ago, the issue was a supply issue. Can the industry build enough electric vehicles? Today, to be candid, as I've just said, it's more of a demand issue. The whole ZEV mandate was premised on the belief that if you get people to build these vehicles, somehow the demand will magically increase and people will want to buy them. That just
right as the prices come down.
Yeah, the prices have come down, but there's still concern, particularly people in rural areas. I mean, what you mentioned about people don't drive 400 kilometers, you're absolutely right. If you live in an urban environment, you may well be interested in having a battery electric vehicle. But frankly, if you want to buy a pickup truck, and my paper shows about 20 to 25% of vehicles in Canada are pickups. If you want to buy and use a pickup truck, you may be very hesitant about using an electric pickup truck. Ford F-150 Lightning is a full battery electric pickup truck, and the sales have been okay, but not great. The Cybertruck that Tesla introduced, the sales, frankly, have been very poor, both in Canada and in the United States. So people, even though they're being offered this, people aren't rising to the offer and actually buying them.
Well, we could spend 30 minutes arguing about the Tesla Cybertruck and whether or not it is in fact a truck and whether or not it is something that people want to buy in the age of Elon Musk. But you know what would increase supply of electric vehicles? Dropping our tariffs on Chinese EVs. We only enacted them because the Biden Americans asked us to, and clearly the post-Biden Americans are trying to drive our auto industry into the ground.
We'll get to that in a moment, but you're right. The electric vehicle tariffs that Canada has on China are 100%, and in effect, to a large extent, shut out any sales of Chinese electric vehicles here in Canada. And you're right, Canada did it about a year and a half ago to be in lockstep with the United States. There's a great debate on that issue as to whether that tariff should be raised or eliminated rather or not. I'm not going to get into that. I'm just saying right now, it's a matter of debate. And there are certain areas like the West that say, hey, we should get rid of it because then we can sell canola to China. And people in the auto industry in the East, specifically Ontario, are more hesitant about it. So I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to leave that to people who know more about that issue than I do. All I'm saying is right now, that is an issue. And that is, again, another reason why we aren't having ZEV sales in Canada as high as the ZEV mandate requires.
So you won't play my King Solomon game here because we can't please China and we can't please the United States. If we drop those EV tariffs, the Americans are going to freak out. If we keep them, then we're not going to get our cheap EVs, and China is going to freak out. You're quoted, though, as calling for the need in the ZEV mandate for flexibility when things go wrong. Right. Like what?
Well, the short answer is you won't meet the targets not only in 2026, but in 2027 and beyond. Just to get a little background, the sales in 2024 were fairly decent, 14.5%. But you may remember there were purchase incentives from the feds, from the province of Quebec, and from the province of British Columbia. 5,000 from the feds, 7,000 from Quebec, and 4,000 from BC. All three of those governments announced that the purchase incentives would disappear in the year 2025, in large part because all of those governments have significant deficits, and frankly, they were probably looking to cut expenses in some area, and cutting purchase incentives was one such area. So what happened was you had an acceleration of sales that were accelerated into the 2024 year, and sales went up to 14.5%. What's happened in the first 8 months of 2025, sales have plummeted. They're down to 8%. And that's been consistent for the first 8 months of 2025. And the feds have not indicated, as you said in the budget, they haven't said they're going to increase or reinstate purchase incentives. Quebec has reinstated them to the tune of about $4,000, $2,000 or to a lesser amount. And BC has not done anything. So the sales of ZEVs in 2025 have stayed low. And if you believe that that will continue into 2026, you can well understand why the federal government has waived the requirements for 2026. Let me just give you a further numerical example of why the federal government has waived them. The way you can comply is to either sell ZEVs or to buy certain credits from other companies that have sold more than 20%, or to invest in charging infrastructure and in effect buy credits. But the problem with that is that if you're a company that say sells 100,000 ZEV, 100,000 total sales, and you're only selling 10,000 ZEVs, you're going to be short. 10,000 is only 10%. Maybe you can buy some credits to take you up to 12%, 12,000 credits, but you're still only at 12%. So what you would have to do is the company would have to say, well, I'm going to have to reduce my sales from 100,000 to 60,000. I'm going to walk you through the math. Now 12,000 ZEV credits, that's 20% of 60,000. Now you're in compliance. The only problem is you've had to shut in sales of 40,000 of gasoline vehicles in order to achieve the compliance with a ZEV target. And that's the whole point of the whole message that I'm trying to get across in my paper, that you're going to reduce the sales of gasoline vehicles in order for companies to be able to comply with the rules in the ZEV mandate. And if you don't comply, in my practice as a lawyer, I always used to ask people, what happens if you don't do what you're supposed to do? And what happens is you're subject to penalties under SEPA. And that's criminal legislation. You're either going to be fined. In the extreme, you could have people go to jail. And there have been cases where SEPA have imposed fines on companies for contravening SEPA. And I have to believe that the various light vehicle companies in Canada are not going to expose themselves to that criminal liability, and they would shut in sales. And that would happen in 2026 if the ZEV mandate were in force, and it will continue to happen in 2027 and 28. And I did just an analysis company by company: GM, Ford, Stellantis, Honda, Toyota, Nissan, and so on. And the total for the whole industry would be shut-in sales of about 400,000. That's the 400,000 that I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. So that's what I'm getting at. 400,000 Canadians would go to their dealers and say, "Hey, I'd like to buy that car over on the lot over there. It looks perfect." And the dealer would say, "I'm sorry, I can't sell that to you, Brian. The ZEV mandate is requiring me to prohibit you from buying that and prohibit me from selling that." And I would sit there and go, "Why is that happening?" I'll stop there.
At risk of being accused of being a latte-sipping lefty from a major metropolitan region who doesn't need a car every day, I've spent time working with my community on traffic-related issues and did a lot of reading about what works elsewhere. The dirty little secret to fixing traffic problems is making it as hard as possible to drive while ensuring viable alternatives exist. And it feels like a similar issue. We're not going to get people to buy EVs over an internal combustion engine until we disincentivize the latter and people vote with their wallets.
You're right. People are voting with their wallets. And you know what they're voting to buy? Pure hybrids. The sales of pure hybrids. Remember I mentioned that the sales of ZEVs dropped in 2025? Well, the sales of pure hybrids did the exact opposite. They went up. And so one of the suggestions I make is to incentivize pure hybrids, people buying pure hybrids. Pure hybrids are not perfect, but they are good. And you may remember the expression, the perfect is the enemy of the good. So you should not ignore good things. And the good things that pure hybrids do is they get better fuel economy, about 30 or 40% better, because the electric engine, the electric motor in the pure hybrid is assisting the gasoline engine. In some cases, it's actually the only method of propulsion that's working. I have to full disclosure, I have a pure hybrid, and I can see on my little instrument screen that there are times when it's solely and only using the battery and the electric motor to move me. But when I get out on the highway, that's when the gasoline engine kicks in. So that's one of the things, to use your point, how to incentivize people to move in the right direction. Try to encourage hybrids, encourage hybrids in the ZEV calculation and say, look, the 12% that I mentioned added to the 8% that are currently in 2026, well, that would get you to the 20%. And maybe next year, 2027, or 2 years from now, 2027, more and more people will start to buy hybrids, because that's how people, to use your phrase, are voting with their pocketbook and voting with their feet. And I'll be very candid with you, Michael. I think it's much better to get people to buy what they want to buy rather than force them what they don't appear they want to buy.
So you've disclosed that you own an electric vehicle. Tell me, what was the rationale behind that decision to buy that over an ICE?
Because I thought it was a better vehicle. My wife, frankly, likes it very much. It gets better gas mileage. It does have less emissions, so that's a good thing. And frankly, in the fullness of time, and I don't know how many years that fullness of time is, more and more people will start to buy electric vehicles. The reason why I think people like hybrids is because it's like, why do people jump out of a plane with two, not one, but two parachutes? Because they like a backup. Because the first parachute, for whatever reason, might not work. It's supposed to work, and usually it does work, but if it ever doesn't, you'd like to have a backup. And I think that's why people like hybrids.
So what's your advice to the Prime Minister's office on where to go from here?
Well, the first one is to look at these percentages and accept that realistically, this is what Canadians are doing. And you're going to have a hard political sell if you try to force people to buy things that right now they're not prepared to buy. And you're going to have an even harder political sell if you force companies to shut in sales and Canadians can't buy the 400,000 vehicles that I mentioned that they need to, frankly, to live their lives. And some of them live in rural areas, and some of them just aren't quite prepared to go to the full battery electric vehicle. And plug-in hybrids, I think, are a great thing. Frankly, if plug-in hybrids had been available, I would have bought one like that. But right now, they're somewhat limited. There are not as many plug-in hybrids as there are, for example, battery electric vehicles. And I would say that the government should say to the light vehicle industry, why don't you make what people seem to want to buy? Why don't you increase the number of plug-in hybrids that you offer for sale to people? The next thing I would say is, as I said, include hybrids in your numbers. The third thing I would say is, right now, companies like Tesla, but not only Tesla, but Hyundai and Kia, rather, they produce more than 20% ZEVs or sell more than 20% ZEVs. They can sell those excess credits to other companies like GM, Honda, Toyota, who are less than 20%, and they get a lot of money. As I say, they're basically being paid twice, once when they sell the vehicle and a second time when they sell the credits. Now, in the US, Tesla has been doing that for years because California and other states have that regime that allows that to happen. And Tesla was reporting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue for these excess credits. Over 5 years, probably billions of dollars. The US has seen fit to eliminate that concept, so Tesla won't have it. I would say to the federal government, if you want to continue to do that, fine. But instead of Tesla receiving the money, you should have the federal government receive the money. And frankly, the federal government might be able to use that money to reinstate purchase incentives. In other words, they've got money coming in, they could use the money to do that. Lastly, and this gets back to your point about China, but right now, I would say to the government, or suggest to the government, I'm only suggesting, I'm not in a position to tell them things. I would say to them, consider this. Suspend the ZEV mandate indefinitely unless and until two trade issues are resolved. One, the trade issue with the United States. We all know the U.S. has put tariffs on vehicles made here in Canada and imported into the U.S. And secondly, as you said, Canada has put tariffs on the electric vehicles from China, 100% tariff, which makes it prohibitively expensive to import electric vehicles, even lower priced electric vehicles from China into Canada. Both of those are very much political issues. I'm not going to get into the specifics of the recommendations in that. I would say just don't have this ZEV mandate unless and until both those tariff and trade issues are resolved.
Brian, I appreciate your time and your perspective. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Brian Livingston is a senior fellow with the C.D. Howe Institute and an executive fellow with the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. You can read Brian's work at cdhowe.org. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thank you for joining us.